Thanks, Emma. I would also like to thank Bryn Detman, who drew the illustrations for my talk. I had an idea, and she made it a lot better. So I think that you will enjoy them as well. So this starts 4 months into my first teaching job, when I wondered if perhaps I'd made a terrible mistake. And then 1 year into teaching and 3 years into teaching, I wondered the same thing. Teaching hadn't always been my plan. I started out after college in scientific research, but after a year I thought that perhaps my skill and desire would be better suited towards teaching. But especially in the very beginning, it didn't always seem to be going so smoothly. This wasn't like high school, where I had enjoyed success in most of the things that I had tried, in academics, in sports, in leadership. And while I really liked so many things about teaching, I couldn't help but wonder why it wasn't coming easily to me as so many other things had. And it probably didn't help that I was dating and then married to someone for whom teaching did appear to come very easily. I went back and forth, and I wondered, why am I doing something every day that I'm not great at? And so I tried to decide, should I leave teaching for another career in which I thought that success for me might be more guaranteed? Something like scientific research or medicine. But ultimately, I stuck with it. At one point, I even took 2 years off, but I came back, and for various reasons, have stuck with it until this day. Let me take a little. It wasn't until 5 years ago that I was preparing a talk for my students about the science of happiness that I came upon something that has profoundly changed the way that I approach decisions. It turns out that we overestimate the effect that our decisions will have on our future happiness, an effect called impact bias. And in this classic study, they looked at lottery winners and people who had become paralyzed in an accident. And these two very different situations, we would assume, would have very different results on their future happiness. And they did, but only in the beginning. So it turned out that after about a year, the effects of these two situations, these two groups, essentially came back to what their happiness levels had been before these life-changing events. And so I was able to look back at so many decisions in my life, particularly my decision about teaching versus other careers. And at the time, I thought that the different options that I was choosing between would have a very different impact on my future happiness. But now that I look back, I realize that had I chosen another path, my happiness level today would probably be about the same, and that the very first years of any of these careers would have been really challenging. But the interesting thing is, even as I say that, today I still think that I made the right choice in choosing teaching. But it turns out that this is also part of our psychology. Dan Gilbert talks about our ability or our tendency to synthesize happiness, to think that the choice we made, or that was made for us, was the right one. And even people who we would assume obviously got the worst choice, like spending time in prison or losing out on large sums of money, in many cases, these people have said that they thought that they were actually better off. And so, as a teacher, I look at the decisions that my students are going to struggle with in the upcoming years. Where to go to college, what major to pick, what career to pick, what first job. And I can't help but think they would be a little more relaxed if they knew that their decisions aren't going to affect their future happiness as much as they think. And that whatever they choose, they're probably going to think that they made the right choice. But I think the main issue that I had in my struggles about teaching were that I had walked into it expecting it to be like the rest of my life up until this point, where things had come relatively easily. And so it wasn't what actually happened, but it was my expectations about what should happen that were the problem. And in many ways, my first year's teaching were very similar to my first year's teaching at EAB. By this time, I had been teaching for 8 years, and I actually thought that I was pretty good. This isn't going to come as a big surprise, but the way that you get good at things is sometimes talent, but more often it's lots and lots of practice. And so I had been teaching for a while, I had more practice, and I had become a better teacher. But when I arrived at EAB, I was at a new school. I was teaching IB for the first time. I was in a new country with a new language, and I had a 1.5-month-old baby to add to our family that already had one 3-year-old. And essentially, I was miserable. I didn't think that I was a pretty good teacher anymore, and it really wasn't any consolation that I was now working harder than I ever had in my life. And even in my second year at EAB, I couldn't help but feel like there was something unfair about what I was being asked to do. I really didn't understand, how is it possible for anybody to be a great teacher, a great mom, and still get enough sleep at night? And here's where the life-saving advice comes in. Last year, I read a blog by Eric Barker that was talking about the psychology or the work of Albert Ellis. And Ellis says that the root of much of our anger and anxiety is the result of our reality not meeting our expectations. And Eric Barker in this blog gives this pretty funny example of a broken toaster. So he says, look, if somebody gave you a toaster and said, this thing hardly ever works, it's probably not gonna work, and then it didn't work, you wouldn't think anything of it because that's exactly what you expected to happen. If, however, you went out, you spent 300 reais on the most amazing toaster ever, and then it didn't work, most of us would be pretty annoyed. But so the funny thing is that the same thing happened in both of these cases. The toaster didn't work, but it was our different expectations about what should happen that caused our reactions to be so different. And it turns out that we have a lot of unrealistic expectations. We know that bad things happen in the world, but yet we don't expect bad things to happen to us. We view failure as an unnatural bad thing, and we don't expect to make mistakes. Have you ever heard the statistic that 90% of people think they're better than average drivers? Or that 90% of people think that they're better than average socially? Overestimating our abilities causes us to think that good things will happen to us as a result. And while we can't always change these expectations, and we can't always change what happens to us, it turns out that we can go back and change our expectations after the fact. And I've tried this many times in the past year, and it actually works pretty well. A couple months ago, I accidentally replied all to an email, and so an email that I had intended to send to one person was sent to everybody on the staff. And at the time, I was really embarrassed, mortified, and I thought this had ruined my day. So I tried my new trick. I looked at my expectations, and I realized that because I'm usually very careful about things like this, I expected that I would never, ever mess up. And when I looked at that expectation and realized that it was pretty much totally irrational, I could actually not be as upset and go about the rest of my day. And it hasn't just been the little things that I've adjusted my expectations about. I went back and I looked at my life and my expectations about, my job and myself, and have readjusted them where I needed to. For example, why did I expect that I would be able to find the most perfect job in the world? Right now, I actually think that I have a pretty sweet gig. And in the very first years of my job, why did I have this expectation that I would have the natural talent to succeed immediately in a job that so many people struggle with? And last year or 2 years ago, why did I expect that I could be a great mom, a great teacher, and still get enough sleep? Readjusting expectations doesn't mean settling for mediocrity or not putting in the effort. Honestly, I always was trying to be a great mom and a great teacher and still get enough sleep. But having realistic expectations prevents me from being upset or angry when this is not my reality. There are some days that I don't grade papers because I want to get some sleep. There are other days that I stay at school and don't get to spend as much time with my kids. And then there are other nights when I play with my kids and I stay up late to get my work done. But whatever happens, I don't worry about it as much anymore, which leaves more time to actually get things done or spend more time on the parts of my life that are actually proven to affect happiness, most notably the strength of personal relationships. And speaking of relationships, I haven't only readjusted the expectations for myself, but the people that I deal with on an everyday basis. I now have more realistic expectations for my kids, my spouse, my coworkers, my bosses, and my students. I'm a lot happier, and probably so are they. At the end of last year, I looked at everything in my life, and I realized that I was maybe a B+ teacher, and probably an A- mom, and I was probably getting a B in fitness, and I was an A- friend and an A- family member. And when you added it all together, I was probably getting a B+ in life. High school me, where things had come easily, probably wouldn't have been that impressed. But 34-year-old me recognized that for my current situation, this B+ was an amazing achievement. I think about my students a lot, and I think that a lot of their anxiety could be reduced if they examined what they're expecting of and for themselves. If failure and mistakes were an expected part of life, I think that they'd be a lot happier. We can still want and try to get the A+ or the 7 on the IB, or to win the game, to be the lead in the school play, to get enough sleep. But our wants shouldn't be the same as our expectations, and I think we'd be a lot happier if we realized the difference between the two. The next time you feel yourself getting angry or upset, take a look at your expectations. Were you expecting something unrealistic? In life, choose a path that you think you'll like, but don't agonize over whether it's 100% the best path, because it's not going to make as big of a difference as you think. 10 years from now, or maybe 3 months from now, you're gonna look back and think you made the right choice. You don't already have to be the best, and maybe you never will be. If you work hard, you'll get better. You can control your own effort, but you can't control all the factors that will determine your success. And if you get frustrated, you can always re-examine your expectations and move on. Right now, I might be getting an A- in life, and I might still be a B+. I don't know if I'll ever be an A+, and that's okay. Because in the meantime, I'm going to try to take my expectations and turn them into a broken toaster. Thank you.